College and Orchard Park, I would assume, and also members of the Hamilton District School Board, and my good friends Edmund, who I met recently, and Thomas. It'd be interesting to speak about Thomas and our connection goes back a long way in terms of our participation in FIRST. So I just wanted to double check one thing before we get going. I have a presentation, but you'll notice in my classrooms I don't really talk all that much. And so one thing I do like to do is involve everyone in the discussions. So we are approximately an hour or so, aren't we? Okay, so our topic today is Ontario as a team, and here's what I thought we might do. I might just share a few ideas about why would we want Ontario to be thinking as a team. Why should all the FRC teams, this is an FRC related discussion, although some of the things we discussed could also apply to FTC and Lego League and everything in general. Why would we want to have Ontario as a team, and what would the benefits be? What might we imagine? And then I'm hoping to involve you in some discussion ideas about what have you seen in the past that has worked to create support for other teams and a network and a strong sense of community, and what is the benefit of that? So I can tell you from the very first moment I learned about FIRST Robotics, it's not when we started the team. It was like 4 months later when I went to my first competition. I had no idea what it was all about until we went there in Windsor, and the strong support offered by various teams was transformative for my students and for me as well. And that's something I was just always very excited about, that we transcend this idea of competition and we make it a true co-opetition. Welcome, welcome. It's all important. No worries at all. Make it slightly easier to pass by. There we go. So I hope that by the end of our session this morning, we might have a few practical ideas and maybe start communicating and enunciating a vision of what it might look like to develop Ontario as a team. And so let's see what this might involve. We can go through the rationale of doing such a thing. I researched a little bit about systems thinking in terms of preparing this conversation this morning. Maybe a few concepts from systems thinking can inform our discussion. There's something called the 19 moral capabilities. This was a framework used at a school that I went, or I was actually a teacher there for 10 years. And it was really another kind of transformative experience aside from FIRST. Of course, my phone, the emergency department. Oh no, I have to answer this. I'm very, very sorry. Hello?
What? Oh.
Moral capabilities is a framework of human transformation with a commitment to the betterment of the world that was applied at my previous school, and it informs the way that we interact, first starting with our personal qualities and then interpersonal qualities, and then as a group affecting what happens in all of society. And so that was an interesting sort of story that informed my previous school, and then maybe some practical measures that we could come up with to enact Ontario as a team. And please feel free to jump in anytime. This is not really an offload of information. It is meant to be a spark of discussion and idea generation. So please take it like that and just jump in anytime you like. So I found this quote just lying around in one of my previous PowerPoint presentations, and I just left it there. Anyone would like to read it for us? Whose eyesight is really good? Oh yes, thank you.
The way a team plays as a whole determines its success. You may have the greatest bunch of individual stars in the world, but if they don't play together, the club won't be worth a dime.
Are you a robot?
I am Ruba.
Yes, so nice to see you. Thank you so much. So, what does that mean to you, Ruba, this quote?
I think it kind of, it aligns very nicely with the idea behind FIRST, on how everyone has a part to play inside of the whole team, and without those individual parts, you can't make a whole.
Yeah.
Right? It's just like a puzzle. You have to put all the pieces together in order to get the big picture.
Amazing. And I think we often experience that very strongly within a team, and I think we have the foundations for experiencing that between teams here. However, the potential is much greater. That's my intuition, my feeling, that there could be an extremely strong support across the province that will, well, maybe we'll see what the vision could be. Imagine 10 Canadian teams on Einstein Field. Now that sounds a little bit far-fetched, but we only sent 11 teams there this year, and of those 11, I would say probably 5 or 6 were very close to making it, weren't they? Or at least they were very competitive robots. So it doesn't take too much of a stretch of the imagination. If we were to send 20 teams there, the 20 best teams in Ontario, all of them could potentially be on Einstein. And through a very strong culture of cooperation and cooperation to its fully developed potential, we can imagine that thing. And that's not to say that, we're going to beat the, no, it's how can we learn as a system how to powerfully support each other and have a measurable outcome. So I thought that would be a measurable outcome. That just by sort of casual play in the World Championships, oh yeah, we made it to Einstein. It's kind of like because there was so much support that went into that. And I took inspiration from this photo I found, and Stan Hunter just mentioned this in the previous session, the A team, which happened several years ago, where 3 Canadian teams formed an alliance and made their way onto Einstein Field as an alliance. And this presentation came about as a result of hearing stories from the members of the FIRST community because, well, I've never been to the World Championships. My team's another story. Our World Championships was a moving robot on the field. But the story that happens in the World Finals is that when a Canadian team advances to Einstein, suddenly all the other teams there rally around and put all their love and energy into making that team successful. So we have the cultural beginnings of this powerful support. The only suggestion from this presentation is instead of thinking about that in April, on the very last day of FRC each year, what about thinking about it on the first day? And what difference would that make? Let's rally around each other as if you're already about to go onto Einstein Field and see what kind of powerful difference that might make. Just a few different habits here and there could make a very big difference over time. So the question from this presentation this morning, or this discussion this morning, is how might we achieve this? So I would really love to hear everyone's thoughts on that. I think there are some practical ways that we could come up with. So some of the rationale here, we do have this strong culture of gracious professionalism. I know this from the very first moment I was at a competition. It just overwhelms you. It was actually, I found it personally overwhelming. I couldn't even think or breathe because there's so many offers for help coming in. but how could we strengthen this culture to strongly support our teams? And so to begin the process of this exercise, I suppose, I start investigating systems thinking. And when we start looking into systems thinking, it points out a lot in the literature and the books written about it that it requires a little bit of a different way of thinking. Because we are accustomed in our society to be thinking in a linear and analytical way. We break down things into the individual parts and understand them. Even the way we study in university, we highly specialize in a very narrow focus. I remember some of my professors, they used to remark, at the end of their lecture, they start out introductory. By the end, the last 5 minutes of their lecture, only 5 people in the world could even understand what they're talking about. Because they're so highly specialized, narrow focused, analytical. That doesn't always solve problems. Different kinds of broad-based and interconnected thinking can solve problems in different ways. So I thought we would just go through a few of the major points of systems thinking. This is not an introductory course, but just for the point of view of understanding what actions could arise from thinking in this framework. So the first one is interconnectedness. So since everything is connected, there's power in networking. And has anyone ever experienced this power of making connections between people and leveraging the connections between people?
Yeah, in 2016, I went to the Stanley Cup Championship as a spectator, and I believe the registration...
Stanley or Stanley?
Stanley Cup,
Stanley.
not Stanley Cup. This is robotics we're talking
Yeah, I know.
and I believe there was 48 hours left before registration fees were due that year. And my team was like $3,000 short. We were pretty sure we weren't going to compete. But because of the connections we had there, Mark Bredner from First Canada actually linked us up with a company who was hoping to sponsor a team that hadn't found anyone yet.
Wow.
And through them and some community donations in the last 48 hours of registration fee time, we managed to get everything together. I think we had $6 to spare. And we made it. Just because of the power of connection.
Wow. Yeah, there's quite an interesting phenomenon that has taken over the world. Networking has always been important, but it became much more powerful in the day of the internet. And now we can network all around the world and start to make connections in a very interesting way. Like, for example, I met one of the founders of your school in Florida once, just through networking. It was very interesting. Mr. Clement Chan. Yes.
So I currently go to the University of Waterloo,
Oh, yeah.
and in one of my classes, there was a girl that was wearing Ontario Champs shirt. And so then right after class, I go up to her and I'm like, hey, what's your name?
Wow.
And then I get to know her, and it turns out that at the school, they're building some sort of rover that's going to like travel in the desert and in like similar conditions to sand. And so then she was like, I can get you hooked up on the Discord, and like you can help with that if you'd like.
Oh, amazing.
So, like,
so there you
it's amazing.
get into these connections right away, and right away the
Yeah.
Ontario Champs. The first network is quite a powerful network, and I went to Ottawa last week, and if everyone knows the history of the year 2020, on the 13th of March 2020, it was scheduled, well, the first event in Ottawa, the first FRC event in Ottawa was scheduled to happen, and 4 hours before that, they had canceled it. So the people in Ottawa were really disappointed, traumatized by this, especially Carleton University. Went out on a limb and then fell flat. It was a really very difficult time for everyone, and in terms of first, I was so close to having it. So there's a lot of desire to have this again. I went there for a week. I sent an email to every publicly funded school prior to my trip, and I received nearly 1 response, actually 0. But I also went through the First Network, the Slack channel, and everyone I knew in the First community in Ottawa, I phoned and connected to people who knew people. And at the start of my week, the Monday was kind of slow. By the end, I went through 72 hours of just continuous meetings. And it was through this powerful support of the First community that kind of helped to this time of year, now we're trying to learn what is first with our new students. We're trying to imagine how are we going to have a great season and a great year, and we're having an educational process at this time of year. We have these conferences. What does it look like using the power of interconnectedness to strengthen our teams? That's a question. So I already talked about this kind of synthesis, a broad-based and interconnected way of thinking, as opposed to breaking down things into their individual parts. Please, most welcome.
Or just come in and take some pictures.
Sure.
Use as apologies.
So this is not often taught in school. When we study chemistry, we start with a material, we say that's made up of molecules, and the molecules are made up of atoms, and we keep on breaking it down into its individual parts. After a while, that actually doesn't make sense. Well, what is a quark? We try to picture it as a particle. A quark is some kind of energy phenomenon with wave qualities, and kind of hard to see. It's a little small. But the point is, we're breaking this down, this knowledge down into individual spots. It's almost like compartmentalizing it. And even people in a university, there's the English department, there's the physics department. No, they should not meet. But actually there are real benefits to, well, that's why they have STEAM. Connecting different ways of thinking together is really a very beneficial kind of exercise. What does that mean for our FRC teams? Thinking in a synthesis-oriented way instead of just an analytical way, which is a very typical habit in our society. So, feedback loop. This is the third of about 4 or 5 elements of the ways of thinking in a systems thinking kind of view. What is a feedback loop? Has anyone ever experienced a feedback loop?
Sure. Can you put a microphone too close to the speaker?
That's what I was thinking. Oh, in terms of a physics example, this resonance to infinity, it kind of breaks the microphone and your ears. Hopefully, there are cases like that in physics. The feedback loop is so strong, they have to cut the equipment off so that it doesn't burn itself out. And
If we're looking for FRC examples, I guess it would be with team leadership.
Yeah.
I've been on teams where they specifically choose their team leadership at the end of the previous year so that they can create success in the following year.
wow.
So they already know who's, the team sub-department heads or the team captains, and they can start planning over the summer, and then when those students graduate, they already have the knowledge of who's going to replace them and how to train them. And that creates a positive feedback loop.
Amazing. There's some even simpler ones. That's a really great one. And yeah, resonance of the microphone. Another feedback loop is your house heating. It's too cold. Okay, we turn on the furnace. And then the thermostat recognizes, oh, now it's hot enough. And so it turns it off. And it gets a little hotter, and then it gets colder again. And it actually goes in a wave pattern. It reaches hysteresis. But this feedback loop keeps it within a range of temperature. And another feedback loop you could look at, individual interactions. So when I interact with someone at a tournament, or when I'm building my robot, how can I interact, and what difference does it make? So, what difference does that make? Why is it important? Why I think of, or how I interact with people? Why should I think about that?
Anyone you meet at a competition can lead to a network or can lead to resources that would be beneficial to either you or them.
Yeah, interestingly, in systems thinking, small, systematically applied actions can accumulate and become a much bigger trend over time. And first has a framework we can work within: gracious professionalism and cooperation. And if you think deeply about those, every interaction is an opportunity to display this gracious professionalism. So you can imagine, if I go to 100 people in a day as I'm at a tournament, and I'm in a bad mood, oh, my robot just broke, get out of my way. And I do that 100 times. Or I could, even though my robot just broke, oh my robot broke, maybe you'd like to help me fix it, or we're being very, we're capturing the opportunity in the crisis, and we're encouraging others, and oh wow, maybe we can help you with your robot that just broke. these little interactions, 100 negative ones or 100 positive ones, you can start to see it can actually affect a system. You can actually experiment with that in your own life. Like, for example, I've been to workplaces when I came to this organization, oh, it was terrible. Everyone was depressed. Everyone's, oh, this person's bad and that person's no good, and they're never helping us out. They never understand us. And if you imagine over a couple years just having little conversations and finding their little bright spot in those little negative things, over time you can actually feel the influence that you can have in a system, and it can change an entire workplace culture if you're very systematic about it. And what if we were to do that over the entire province of Ontario? Because all we have to do is realize that each little interaction is one grain of sand on a beautiful beach. And the beach needs lots of grains of sand, and yeah, systems need lots of systematically applied actions that accumulate over time. And if we are conscious about this as a whole community, imagine the difference it can make, because every little interaction is like accumulating interest in your bank account at a higher rate. It makes a huge difference over time. So, when we start to think of all of these things, everything is interconnected, and we start to think synthetically in terms of connecting things together in our thinking and understanding these little feedback loops. When I speak nicely to someone, then that person feels better, and they're more inclined to speak nicely to someone else and support someone else and help someone else, and it causes certain things to happen in a system. So we might be able to start to understand how a vision for an extremely competitive jurisdiction in the entire province might be the sum of a whole bunch of moving parts in a system. Whoops, going backwards. And sort of a phenomenon we've already alluded to in our discussion. All of this is connected together in a way. A amazing jurisdiction with a thriving set of robotics teams supported by gracious sponsors or generous sponsors is the sum of a whole bunch of these little interactions. I was reflecting on Mr. Hunter's presentation he just made. He was thinking systemically. He was like identifying the resources already in the boards. There were VEX kits here, and there are FRC kits there, and there are FRC teams here, and there are board officials there. How can we connect everyone together? And he said that's why they have this 2056 conference, this very idea of networking. So then, how does Ontario sort of become more than the sum of its parts? And that's some of the questions that we can sort of answer through our deliberation. And maybe there's something we could do to map out, well, what is FRC in Ontario? How does my team fit in the bigger network of teams? Oh, I'm located in this city. Oh, there's a school down the road. Thomas was able to make that connection. There was another school just down the road, and that connection was made in this conference. I heard that happen just half an hour ago. And these conferences and other events like this can be an opportunity for us to make these networking sort of connections. So I think we can sort of just maybe take this as an impetus for us to think about how our individual teams might interact within a whole system, and how can we support each other. So maybe if some of you have some thoughts about, maybe you've experienced something like that already, or you would like to experience something like that. What are your thoughts? Where are we at, and where could we be with this kind of thinking?
So like just, as someone who knows enough to know that FRC scares the crap out of me, like how do you, like you probably have like tons of people like that. They're like, feels like a big jump.
I think I was protected in my first year of FRC by my sheer ignorance.
Yeah.
I had no idea. And it took me a few years to come to terms with that, because I thought of it like, oh, I'm a teacher, I'm running an extracurricular. So one teacher, one extracurricular. I had no idea that these other teams had whole networks of sponsors, and I had no idea about that at all. And it took me a few, like by 2020, my team had 5 solid mentors, really great connections, and we were getting somewhere, and of course, they pulled the plug. I think one of the biggest phrases I've been sharing in the last year is many hands make light work. If you look around to the most successful teams, they often have some really talented individuals, but they always have teams of these talented individuals and teams of sponsors. Not just one main sponsor, it's a whole system of sponsors with multiple different inputs. 2056 is a great example. They made a presentation in May on a Zoom call, and they have whole systems of fundraising and lots of teachers, if it's in a school, plus parents, plus industry leaders, all sort of mixed together in a nice
So what's the pathway from, I don't have a team, to, that just seems like a black tunnel that I don't see how you.
That tunnel's
connect with.
surprisingly quick and
So-
surprisingly easy.
It depends on how intrepid you are. Like my path, I don't recommend it. I just started a team. My student and I, we figured out how much we had gotten ourselves into as we went along. I think my recommendation to people I see now is like, get a team of 5 people. Say your teachers, or a set of teachers and students. So for example, 3 students at the school in Markham, they approached me back in May. And I just kept on telling them, okay, you're gonna have to start building your network. They started doing that over the summer, and now they have a team. They managed to speak to 2 teachers at their school who were willing to become their mentors, and they gradually built it up. I think when you start as well, you can draw on the support of other teams. And so if you have another team in your area, they can offer you perhaps some ideas about how to do CAD, or maybe your students could do an online session of coding. And there's lots of ways to share resources. And in my experience, and that's how I know Thomas from so long, his team was in London and so is mine, and we happened to get together by sharing a bus to North Bay in 2017. And during that process, we also did movie nights and coding sessions and business and social events, and it was a really great experience. So the support of other teams is invaluable. Yeah.
I believe when Stan founded 2056, they didn't actually compete the first year they founded it. They got all the information, they went to the kickoff, they built a robot, and they didn't compete. You have to verify that with Stan, because that's the format.
That explains a lot.
Yeah,
Well,
and just thinking
But it
systematic.
gets you into the understanding of all that you're gonna have to, the totality of what you're gonna have to do to some degree
Yeah.
before you ever actually do compete and spend that money on any of the events, right? So it's helpful from that perspective. And yeah, most teams are very open to helping out. I know a couple of years ago, the year that we got COVID crushed, we had another team that didn't end up surviving because it was their very first year, came to our kickoff and saw our process for analyzing the game, analyzing what we thought would make a successful robot and things like that, right? Our brainstorming session during kickoff, which is a really big part of getting your season off to a good start.
I think that's a really good mindset.
And like you guys went from 0 to FRC here, right?
Yes.
Like we're thinking of FTC ladder, like in an FTC team,
Mhm.
once you have those teams, like,
That's
then you got
actually
like.
really good.
Creating a talent pipeline means you
Yeah.
don't need to worry so much about recruiting
Yeah.
the
I
best
know what
students in
robotics is,
school.
never doing big robotics.
Yeah,
So that's actually a really solid thing to have, because you already have an idea by that point that's involved. It's just a slightly bigger robot.
In shorter timelines.
Yeah. And I guess you get a lot of practice. You have a CAD group, and you have a coding group, and a assembly group that transforms into your fabrication and manufacturing group, I suppose. And it's a little bit more challenging on all those fronts, but it's quite
And
manageable.
a level of enthusiasm
Yeah.
and awareness of it in the school, because if you don't have awareness, then you don't get the people that you need as a resource too, so.
yeah. One of the things that really helps a lot of teams, specifically the rookie teams last year, while we're still recovering from COVID, is the every bot build that running team puts on. So sort of like with the FLL kits and stuff, where you have a couple of designs that are public knowledge that people know how to build. They produce that in 2 weeks. There's other RI3D, Robot 3D
So what
teams.
is, I've seen the FTC 3 days.
FTC is in 30 hours, I believe,
Yeah.
they build a robot. This is across 3 days with exclusively mentors,
Okay,
and it serves multiple purposes. So an I'm running an RI3D out of my school this year, and our goal is to train mentors from multiple teams on what the specific game rules are for that year. So that the mentors know whether the students are building something properly or not. That was the number one issue that I encountered as a volunteer in 2022, that the rookies, they don't know what the rules are, they don't know what bumpers are. I had to make, I think, 4 sets of bumpers at competitions for other games. So looking at RI3Ds or participating in RI3Ds, if there's one in Toronto or another one in Hamilton, lets the mentors know what they're in for, and it gives sort of a fallback design to the students that don't come up with something themselves quick enough. Yeah, there's all kinds of content online. FRC 118 is a great example with their every bot build. They release everything publicly after the first 2 weeks of build season, and because build season in Ontario is like 6.5 to 8 weeks depending on competitions, you've got time to analyze what they've got and possibly make upgrades.
That's another nice aspect, because the Everbot is one step up, because once you have the Everbot designs and maybe a team to support, like for example, 1241 was offered to manufacture parts for Everbots for teams here in Ontario. So Fanshawe College and or Humber College have been involved in that. So you can imagine, in your first year, you get the Everbot designs, you study them with your students, you understand how they've done it, and it becomes more like a assembly process for your first time through, rather than from scratch realizing, oh wow, we just made a design decision, it's not reversible. And so we had 11 teams that I know of do it last year in Ontario, and it seems to have been very successful, especially those teams that had some time to practice and realize that the basic design of the Everbot, it didn't hang quite right. You had to balance it with weights to make sure that it actually would.
Battery placement was critical.
Yes.
What's interesting is a lot of people go for the Everbot, but I've won competitions with a defense bot. It's not impossible. In fact, I think 2056 picked me that year. Yeah, I've gone to semifinals with a box on top of a driver.
Well, I saw that on the news, the team, I think it was a Vancouver competition, they just ripped everything off the top onto the base and made it.
Yeah, the base is the rookie kit of parts, so you can opt out of it in later years, but there's, Andy Mark makes this kit, about $700 or something like that. It's got the motors, gearboxes, and the chassis of the lower half, and then you add the electronics as a board on top, and it looks kind of like those research bots you see in like skills competitions, but it means that essentially day one, you can have a chassis built and ready to compete. And so you can spend 6 weeks programming while you figure out what the top half's gonna look like. You don't need a top half, it'd be advantageous, but not 100% necessary for your rookie year.
A nice point about the Everbot, if you do happen to get it finished at a certain point, then you can start modifying it. By the end of the season, you can tell that some robots had been an Everbot at one point, but they clearly weren't anymore, because they had added things on it. I really also like the CME competition, Celtics. They started the weekend with 2 robots, one was just a rectangle, but by the end
Well,
of
that's
the
Team
competition,
Dave you're thinking of. actually.
but they were, oh, that was Team Dave?
That was 99 was Team Dave.
Okay.
Celtics showed up with 2 fully built robots.
Oh yeah, I'm so sorry. But actually both
One
of them
that
were
they
a good
built in
story.
like 4 weeks over the summer.
One was the rectangle bot, I'm sorry about that. But by the end of the weekend, it was making a difference in the competition. And the point, that's why I mixed it up with Celtics, because you started with a brand new bot, hadn't been tested that much yet, and it was shooting baskets all over the place in the first match. By the end, it was making a huge difference in the outcome of the competition. And so those are 2 examples of progress you can make. And also support of other teams during the CNE. They're switching around team members and drivers, like 1374 had no team members or something.
Yeah, I was drive coach on 1374 as the team queuing volunteer. Like they just went, oh, you're on this team now. Oh, okay.
Yeah. And that's a kind of a nice element of our culture where we can powerfully support each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's the idea, like maybe we could be systematic about that and map out each FRC team in relation to the other FRC teams, companies, teachers and mentors in schools, and see how that looks. So that's a suggestion, haven't started that yet, but maybe there are practical steps we can take. So I just wanted to mention this very quickly, like this is a whole other topic of, like entire books have been written about this. This is actually the framework from a university in Bolivia. I once visited it, and they discovered that, well, just because of this analytical thinking, in a university we're segregated from the rest of society, that was not meeting the needs of the people of Bolivia. So they did some systematic work in the communities and tied their university programs to outcomes, real outcomes in villages and towns. And through about 30 years, they came up with this framework of capabilities. 6 of them are personal. And for example, just understanding the historic period in which we find ourselves, being systematic and reflective, and
Just coming from the Russell Point, talking to Scout's office.
And so the first is building the state that's your own capabilities to be productive and helpful to others. The second 6 capabilities, one of my favorites, is encouraging others and bringing happiness to their hearts. And we find that a lot in the first. That's a very strong quality that comes with a gracious professionalism and this culture of support in the teams. And then the 6 societal capabilities, this is systemic thinking. And one of them is actually thinking systemically in search for solutions, but it goes to the level of making reciprocity in relationships the dominant form rather than relationships of domination, which we find out in the world. And so they actually found, by implementing this system of moral capabilities and tying school lessons to practical outcomes in the community, they were changing societal structures in the end. And it became such a popular curriculum, it was applied all the way through all of Latin America. So this is a very interesting set of school framework. My previous school in Stratford actually adopted this, and they have some very interesting side effects of adopting this as a framework in the school. My students, for example, like you would never have this in a public school. At the age of grade 11, one of my students was responsible for the school's entire network. And he designed and implemented the software and the server. We had a friend who was volunteering. He came in to help him with that, and he did incredible things with that. We had 54 computers, all of them thin clients, served by one server, no software installed, press one button, all 54 of them have new software, all done by a grade 11 student. He did a co-op in the hospital, and they made him write down labels of internet jacks. He was very unsatisfied with that. So I think this is just another example of a framework of systemic thinking that has had real results in the world, and that's why it was adopted by my previous school. They've added the 19th moral capability, creating a sense of beauty in every endeavor, and that's also a part of FIRST. We have beautiful uniforms, and when you get to it, your robot becomes beautiful if you can manage. That's one we were working on in my school.
It's beautiful to us.
It's working, that's beautiful.
Yeah, the blinking lights on it.
And so I mention this in the idea that we can think of our individual capability to help others, and then our interpersonal interactions, and then the sum of all of these things is what we call in systems thinking emergence, when we can start transforming societal structures. And that was one of the purposes of FIRST, to transform this culture where we would see engineers celebrated alongside with movie stars and entertainers and athletes and all of this. So, whole other book, whole other chapter. So, I guess the idea here, well, what can we do? That's a big system all of Ontario. However, each individual can make a huge difference. And every interaction can count. And this idea of considering others around us and doing our very best to be powerful, to support them and to encourage them, creates this very big difference. And this idea, if we keep on getting better at that, it also makes a huge difference. Even small incremental improvements make a huge difference in a dynamic system. And that's the question I put before us today. How can we let this culture of FIRST sort of reach its full potential here in Ontario? What might we do to achieve it? So I suppose we find ourselves in this dominant culture of competition. It's either you're in or you're out. You're either good enough or not. Like you write a test, oh, you're no good, you failed. And only the very best best people get to go to this university, and this kind of thing, that it's all or none, and it's one winner and a bunch of losers. But this sort of systemic thinking recognizes our power is through our connections, not through our dominance of other people. And what does that mean when that starts to permeate our culture more strongly? Because we have these teams in communities that are heavily competition driven still. I think if we were to understand the possibility of transcending this mindset, our interactions might end up being different, and we would see a whole other life and capability in our whole system. That's my suspicion. The question remains to be answered by our collective efforts, where we might go. So now we come to chemistry, back to analytics and breaking things down. The chemists at one point discovered two different types of bonds that I remember, aside from the temporary bonds. Anyway, we're not getting into chemistry. One of the main types of bonding you learn about is ionic bonding. And ions, they kind of flow freely. So we have something in Ontario called the Mobile Alumni Crew. We're still looking to fill it out. It looks like Ottawa is going to have a very nice addition, as we have an alumni association at Ottawa University with 11 members just starting. These FRC alumni, they float around Ontario in their cars, I guess they drive around, and they support other teams. And this has already been happening before. We had a little bit of it last year, given the limitations of our situation, but we have a lot of commitment from several friends from Windsor to Ottawa to be able to do this and support new teams and existing teams with expertise and knowledge. And it doesn't have to be in the car. Sometimes if you're going to build something, it may need to be in the car. But even last year, a lot of Zoom calls really helped all across the province. Numerous stories about that. So that's ionic bonding, but covalent bonding, that's another one. And I really would love to discuss the concept of covalent bonding with the help of terms. The covalence crew. What does that mean to you, Thomas?
So that's an initiative that my new rookie team 9062 is hoping to start up. And the idea behind this is pooling resources for the greater good of the teams that perform the covalence crew. So like a covalent bond, you've got these free-floating electrons, right? And as they come into contact, they form a stronger bond by sharing electrons between the particles. So what we're trying to do is, some teams don't have enough mentors, some teams don't have anyone who knows CAD, some teams don't have anyone who knows code, some teams don't have enough funding to meet the registration fees. But some of these teams in that array are really strong in other areas. So how do we leverage other people's strengths to help fill out others' weaknesses? And the goal of the covalence crew is to get a group of traditionally lower resource teams with really specific strengths to play to their strengths to help everyone else succeed. So we're building our own success by taking what works and learning to deal with what hasn't worked so far. So we've already got a couple of teams on board. October 6th, I'm going to be running a CAD session with both 9062 and 5036, the RoboDevils. And I've already loaned parts out to 3739 Robotics, 3161 Tronic Titans, and 6135 Arctos. So that's so far the covalent bonds that we have been forming. My school is a private school, Columbia International College here in Hamilton, and one thing that we've got is we've got space. We have 1,700 square feet of classroom space that can be used for robotics. That's my classroom. So what we're doing is we're slowly turning it into kind of a maker space specifically aimed at STEAM curriculum. I've got 4 students in this group today. None of them happen to be in my robotics class, but most of them came from my civics and careers class. And they can attest that the room is giant, that the AC is nice and cool, and there's always robot stuff going on, whether we're in robot class or not. So the goal with that is to share what we have, which happens to be some really strong school backing, to help other teams who maybe don't have that.
So unfortunately, the diagram here is not really a covalent bond. funny Valentine's card. In the correct diagram, at least one of those electrons would be between the two atoms. And so we can just imagine that we have two atoms and the electrons kind of get shared between them.
And you've got two.
So I think that's just one example of what we might do, thinking systemically to see how we can boost Ontario. When we think like that, suddenly one team that would have not quite had the coding skills is now making it to the Ontario Provincial Championships or going to Einstein. It doesn't matter where. It improves the system throughout when we start thinking like that. And it really would create this even more powerful feeling of community. Yes.
There's also Team Day Waterloo. I'm recently like trying to help out with them, and they were talking about how they have a system of networking
Yes.
within like the Waterloo, Windsor, Kitchener region, where like all of the teams will combine their resources or like try to help out each other. So I feel like if we were to able to expand that
Yeah.
within all of Ontario,
Exactly.
that would be amazing.
So
Yeah, you're
that's-
talking about the Wolf Road group,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's a great example. There are the foundation has been laid for this powerful way of sharing. We also have what we know as hubs. There are 4 teams in Ontario functioning as hubs. So we have these associations like in Waterloo. We have this covalence crew. The hub teams have been offering their services. That's 1241 in Mississauga and 772 in Windsor and 1305 in North Bay, and then 1114 is an online hub, like a help desk online. So all of this together amounts to quite a potential for us to consider all of the teams and how can each one of them benefit from this powerful phenomenon of networking. We also can think about it in terms of sponsorship. For example, if you go to a large company like Amazon, they'll say, "Who are you? You're so small, they can hardly see you." But if you come as 10 teams Amazon, they can just barely understand that you're something worth considering, and they may actually sponsor you as 10 teams as opposed to 1 team. And we, as First Canada, we help to coordinate this sponsorship already with a number of companies. And of course, teams that communicate that will have a likely or a higher likelihood of receiving funding because anyway, I was able to make those connections last year after speaking with individual mentors and then getting phone calls and saying, "We need to sponsor 5 teams in the next 24 hours, because that's how they always work. "Oh yeah, we gotta do that sponsorship thing now before our next review." Okay. Oh no. So that's our sort of discussion this morning. How might we consider Ontario as a team, or maybe Canada as a team, the A team? There is a little bit of suggested reading. A few of them are there. I'm very happy to make this available. I looked into some systems thinking introductory books to prepare this, but also just drawing on the experience of everyone here was a really great sort of element of what happened this morning. We really appreciate your contributions. So I don't think our time is up. We have a little bit more time before everything is ended. I might suggest maybe we could now brainstorm some practical measures. Like, for example, we have the covalence crew, we have the Waterloo Association of Robotics Teams, and so on. What are some of the practical steps that individuals or schools or groups of people may take to build Ontario as a team even more strongly? It's already highly regarded, I'm sure, in the international space.
So at Celtex in Hamilton, we have first aid, which
Excellent.
essentially just like right before comp, we will open up the build space to other teams and like invite them in, have whole days dedicated to cater towards them and just help them with whatever they need. So maybe expanding that throughout Ontario and just like teams that are a bit stronger in terms of facilities and resources, they can open up their space in order to help some of the teams that may be lacking in those areas.
Excellent. That's an amazing example. Yes.
Because so many of the teams are based in schools, often, is it, because I know, for example, the Hamilton, like with the Hamilton's Catholic School, that the superintendent, the person who runs the school board is very
Yes.
supportive person is ensured that I think almost every high school has either FRC team, FTC. I think the goal was to get every school and school board involved in person one way or another. And with that kind of example, whether, whether it's possible to get other school boards, I know that the TDSB provides funding for all the schools, it's like every FRC team gets partial funding of their entry fees every year. And usually there's an actual dedicated staff person who helps organize the schools. It used to be Annika Pence, then,
Now it's
Yeah.
Mahfouza Rahman.
but having, that's something that if the school board doesn't have something like that, that's something to push towards,
Yeah.
is whether, because I know that Mr. Yasui used to be our lead mentor. He worked at a board and his job was to encourage schools to develop FRC teams. So his day-to-day job was like saying, hey guys, if you want a team, what support? And making sure that teams understood that it's more than just building a robot. You need support structure, you need teachers, you need parents, you need alumni, that it's more than just focus on the robot, there's so much more to that, to the team. So that's sort of the next step for a lot of areas that I understand that the Peel region is not quite so friendly. I've heard some stories about that.
It's interesting that you never know what can happen through individual interactions. Like when I was in Ottawa last week, I had the opportunity to spend an hour with the tech lead of the Ottawa Carleton School Board, who was extremely appreciative of the opportunity to connect. He was new in the role. He knew of the existence of FRC and wanted to know who the teams were and how he could support them. And all of those things you just listed, I had the opportunity to share examples about how other boards do it. Financial support, making permission for field trips more easy to acquire, and being flexible.
Go down the roads can be really tough sometimes.
Yeah, so one thing that could happen is the power of networking. Maybe York is not friendly because we haven't made the right connection yet. And maybe if I connect with someone, it's no good, but maybe if another student or another person connects, oh, they suddenly resonate. Maybe just like that right connection has to happen.
Apparently Kilda I was talking to the guys at Inverse Paradox and they're explaining that there were many issues with the board
Yeah.
that have gone away when the province came in, took over the board, got rid of a lot of people.
Yes.
And there's been a mass reorganization, so they're hoping that it's an opportunity to say, we have new people who aren't prejudiced against us. to
That's
spring
interesting. It
programs.
sounds almost like a biological system renewing itself. But that happens. Like sometimes there's a blockage and it just needs to have a little bit of revitalization. So, but hopefully there are ways to do that. So if anyone would like to make those connections, maybe we can find ways to do that.
I think the number one step is interconnectedness, and then we can come up with a plan later. So
Yeah.
I'm happy to offer my email, I mean,
Yeah.
it's a convenient one to remember. If anyone wants to contact me or my
It's
team,
the easiest one.
somehow they didn't use frcontario@gmail.com, so that's my email now.
Excellent. So it's interesting as well, like, what is the plan of a large system? For example, the human body, what is the plan? Well, none of the cells know the whole plan. All the cells know is their own plan. And part of their plan is interconnectedness. The human body is vitally dependent on these interconnections. And we actually experimented with that in the last few years. In the Earth, the whole Earth is interconnected and highly dependent on being interconnected, and we severed a lot of those interconnections, and there is extreme economic upheaval as a result. And so this is interesting that we might not know what the whole plan of Ontario is, but in systems thinking, if we apply principles at the local level, the sum becomes much greater. And part of these principles are, supporting teams where possible. At a certain point in the season, open up your build space. Share your extra financial resources. Share a sponsor. Share a mentor call with a coding session, for example. All kinds of ways it can happen. That adds up to a huge difference over time. So, just referring to my computer, I think one example of the potent phenomenon of systems thinking and networking, the reason that I use this computer system and not Windows and not Apple is for the same reason. And for me, it's a very deeply mysterious phenomenon that unpaid and relatively unconnected people around the world have designed computer software software that runs everyone's phones and underlies much of the world's operation, open source software, Linux, and the like. I just find that's amazing. It transcends borders, it transcends economic zones, and it's able to create software that's as good or even better than what's out there. For example, the top 500 supercomputers in the world would be impossible without this interconnectedness of the internet and the open source software. And I think that kind of thinking applied in a system like FRC has the potential to just do a massive transformation. It could even reach the level of changing societal structures, where schools and communities start to structure themselves differently, recognizing the principles that emerge, that powerful cooperation also makes powerful education. So we'll see where that goes. So I guess that's